All right, the next study application I want to show you is something I call light and color integration. We are going to integrate a sphere, surprise, surprise, into an existing picture. All right, so I've loaded up this picture we remember from chapter 2, and I'm going to paint two spheres. One is going to be in the light, and one is going to be in the shadow. This exercise is intended to test the knowledge we learned in chapter 2. Now, I'll just make a quick circular selection here. Let's put the ball like hovering on top of these bushes and trees in the midground. And I'm going to start painting this. I'll just block in a quick value. Now, this is going to be a white ball. As we learned from chapter 2, the sunlight is a bully. And the nice thing about painting white is white has no local color of its own. It gets all of its color from its influencers. In this case, the sunlight giving its color to the light side, and the shadows getting their color from the ambient light bouncing around. Probably there's going to be a lot of greens in the shadow, for example. So I started with this mid value here because it allows me to get both lighter and darker. Right now that doesn't look like a white ball, so let's fix that. Obviously I'll go lighter in value, and the sunlight is a mid-afternoon sun. It's kind of desaturated, somewhere in the warms here, pretty neutral, characteristic of a mid-afternoon sun. And I'll just put this in, maybe a touch warmer, because I'm seeing a few more warms in the surroundings. So this looks pretty good as a sun color. Now the nice thing about sunlight is, like I said, it's a bully. It doesn't take much thought. That sun is going to be so strongly influencing these colors that this almost is enough. If I want a little bit of a halftone, I'll just go ahead and grab an airbrush here, dip the value a little bit, maybe increase the saturation a bit, and let's use a bit from chapter 4 and just offset that hue a little bit, wiggle it around, you know? Even a bit darker, get this halftone in here. A halftone is where the form is turning away from the light, but not enough to be in shadow. So you get this gradual darkening. And on a sphere, it's very soft. So there we go. That looks like our sphere is hit by sunlight, a white ball hit by sun. Now the shadow doesn't look right. The nice thing about blocking in that mid value that I started with, though, is it does give me a light and shadow separation. But now let's work into the shadows and decide on its color. Well, with any painting, the first thing you want to observe or ask yourself is what colors are in the environment? And I would submit to you that in this case, there are basically two. We will have green colors coming in from below as those trees bounce light up. As well, we will have blue sky coming down. We can't see the sky in this photo, but we know it's up there. And when you're outdoors, a blue sky is a huge influencer on the shadow colors. Now, when it comes to deciding the colors of your shadows, I recommend simplifying. For example, there are red rooftops around here, but they're so far away, I'm not going to try and put red also in the shadow. That starts getting a little desperate color-wise. You want to simplify that. I try and ask myself, what are the one or two primary drivers of color? In this case, it's the green and the blue. So, okay, sometimes I even like to just select the shadow there with the magic wand tool. Then I'll push Ctrl-H to hide that selection. And then just with a soft brush, I'll sample where I'm at and just dial myself into the greens here. And maybe increase the saturation a bit so that the identity of that green becomes a little more apparent. But still in the neutral grays though, nothing too saturated. And I'll start putting that in. And you should already be able to see this sphere starting to fit with its environment, thanks to the bounce light. Now immediately I want to switch gears and put in this blue, so I'll slide myself way up to blue. Again, keeping myself in the grays to start is a good method of ensuring that your colors harmonize. Because again, grays are linked together. That is, colors linked together via grays. Now, if I'm in the blues, I can really pick any blue. I can experiment. How about more of an ultramarine blue? Just make sure you get your value right. For example, this is the wrong value. That blue needs to be lighter because it's reflected light. It's light from the sky coming into the shadow. This looks like some kind of double shadow, so don't do that. Make sure you get your value right. And now this ball is starting to look like it's sitting in this environment. Maybe a little less of the blue. Sometimes the shadow right here can get a bit darker because it gets a bit less reflected light. You know, those greens are really pumping into the bottom of the sphere and the blues are pumping into the top of the sphere. In this middle section, we may have less of each of those. So sometimes I'll get a multiply brush, which I have a preset for here, just an airbrush set to multiply mode. And I'll just just barely darken this area. And while I'm here, I may switch back to normal mode and just further refine this edge between light and shadow. It needs to be a bit softer than this to represent a round form of a sphere. There we go. And if there is a highlight, which there would be, if this was a reflective sphere, that highlight would go right in here, reflecting that sunlight that's shining right on it. Now, let's also not forget a key piece of integration, that is a cast shadow. See, right now, we really don't know where that sphere is in space. We need to ground it with a cast shadow. So I'm going to say that that sphere is kind of sitting right in here. So what I'll do is I'll pick the green of the trees. Now this needs to be a cooler shadow. And I don't just want to sample the shadows in the picture itself. I want to do my own work, right? So, but I could sample the lights and say, okay, that's where the greens are bullied by the sunlight. Let's cool them off by going this way up the color wheel. Drop the value for shadow. And let's start there. That satisfies the requirement of being a cooler shadow. Maybe we'll get a different brush for this, something with a bit more texture, befitting the foliage it's falling on. And let's just paint this in. It looks like it should be a bit darker, so I'll just go. And you notice instinctively I'm changing the hues a la chapter 4. I've committed that to muscle memory now. I do it instinctively. Maybe even cooler and dip it a bit more. The trees will have little pieces of dark accent. That is, pieces where the trees have little holes that you can see through, and those holes get way less ambient light. So little dark accents, they're called. Or another word for that is ambient occlusion. Put those in and just overall work this shadow. You notice it's a spherical shadow or a circular shadow because that ball is projecting the shadows. In fact, this shadow should creep over the rock here, and it should be bluer there because the rock, you see the shadows there on the rock? The rock is a white local color, just like the sphere. So just like that sphere is getting blue here, the rock shadow is going to get bluish influence on it, way less green. And then as that shadow continues to creep over the trees here, we'll go back to that green. So there we go. Something in this range, and I could of course refine this shadow all I want, but this is a great way to practice the things we learn in chapter 2 and also in chapter 4, changing hues and stuff like that. If I had to project a rough estimate of the time it should take you to do a study like this, let's ballpark it at 10 minutes per sphere. All right, so let's move on and put another sphere into the shadow. Let's put it down here, just make a selection. We'll put that sphere like on the road or something. Maybe make it a bit bigger so we can see it better. And I'll do the same thing. Go ahead and block in an overall value. Now this sphere is in shadow, so let's block that value in even a bit darker. I do like to block my values in almost in a medium dark range. I don't always do that, but it is a good idea because now when I go to add something lighter, like the reflected light in this case, you already have a darker value to compare that light with. Now, if you choose to start light, that's fine too. You just have to add shadows first. But sometimes I find that adding light helps the modeling more. That's just my own opinion, my own experience. So I like to start dark and add lights. Now, let's think about this sphere for a second. Because we're in shadow, this is a very different scenario than the sun. I'll tell you the mistake that a lot of people make. They'll say, okay, we're in shadow. There's obviously going to be a lot of skylight coming down, just like we had on this ball here. But here's what they'll do. They'll take a skylight and put it like this in the same direction as the sunlight. But that's wrong. The skylight does not come down in a direction like this. Well, it comes down in a direction, but because the sky is like a 180-degree bowl over top of everything, that skylight comes down evenly like this. So what that amounts to is that the top of the ball overall is going to be lit by the sky. So I just picked this sort of generic lighter blue, and I'm blocking this in. And you can play with different brushes, like here's a sort of rake style brush that kind of does like hatching for you, kind of like digital hatching for free. I do use this brush to mix colors together a lot. And because I'm in the blues, I'm free to change those hues. Again, chapter 4 thinking here, wiggle those hues around a little bit. Try even like purples. Let's see if like I can get a purple working. If it's too aggressive, just gray it off. That will help link it with your other colors. And obviously I'm pressing pretty lightly on my tablet to encourage Photoshop or your painting app of choice to do some mixing for you. So this is already looking good as representative of a ball lit by the sky in shadow. Again, when you're outdoors, the sky will be your sort of primary driver for reflected light. Now here's the next mistake a lot of people make. Remember how in the light sphere we had those greens bouncing up into the shadow? Well, the mistake people will make is they'll think the greens would bounce up into the shadow here. This is also wrong because this whole thing is in shadow. And because it's in shadow, there's way less impetus for light to bounce around. Remember, light only bounces because the sun is so strong that when it strikes something, it has the strength to bounce. But this whole area is devoid of sunlight. There is no light ray strong enough to truly bounce like that. The strongest influencer on this sphere is the light coming down from the sky, like I've already mentioned. So what that amounts to is that the bottom of this sphere is going to actually start dipping into ambient occlusion. Again, the ambient light is being occluded from the bottom of this sphere. Not as much ambient light is able to get there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to warm it up to get away from the cools because there's going to be no cool sky there. So I'm going to go the opposite way, warm it up. And again, this is warmish. It's just a neutral red. And start a bit deeper than that and start painting in this transition to ambient occlusion. Now, underneath the sphere is going to be quite dark because that's where so much ambient light is occluded. There can be very little reflected rays getting under that sphere. It's going to be quite occluded. Same with like where it butts up against the wall here. There's going to be a lot of ambient occlusion here. Now remember, this is not a shadow. The whole thing is a shadow. This is just the ambient occlusion, the darkest part of the shadow. Let me zoom in a little bit here. And I just want to work this transition. I can basically sample where it is, get a neutral sort of warm color, and just bridge this gap. I'm using an airbrush for this mostly because this sphere has such soft color transitions. Because remember, the whole thing is in shadow. So it's like this entire sphere has to be treated like this part of the sunlit sphere, because this was the shadow part, right? There's also not going to be any highlights because there's no reflection of the light source. Just very subtle value and color transitions. I can try and get in a little bit more blue if I wanted to. And this is really now down to aesthetics. How far do you want to push it so that it looks good for you? And hey, there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, to make this sphere maybe harmonize with the scene a bit, let's dip into the greens a little bit. This is less for reflected light reasons and just more for pure aesthetic reasons. Just getting a bit of green into the scene here, into the ball, might help link it with some of the other colors in the scene. That is a technique I use a lot. But I don't want to do something like this and make it look like there's bounced green reflected light. That is not realistic. That wouldn't happen. If I do want to put some greens in, it's just an almost invisible effect. Just subtly linking the environment colors in with what I'm painting here. You know, integrating it, as is the name of this exercise, integration. And all right, there's our finished study. I think in keeping with our cup of coffee time frame. And you know, the thing I want to stress here is even though a sphere is a very basic object, you can still come away with a pretty picture here. It's the light and color that does it, not necessarily the subject matter.